This is the nameless protagonist. I'd like to thank everybody for joining me this morning for another morning blade meditation session. This is coming a little bit late today. Had a few technical difficulties, but we're back again to get this squared away. As you guys can probably see, this is a response video to black pill therapy. The link to his video is in the description of this one. And his video was in response to the last one I did on Jisatsu, or self-deletion. Having been a medical professional that deals with that quite literally, he made an excellent case for bringing these concepts forward. And he shares an idea that I do with regards to the lack of this being present in the space. Those who specialize in therapy, specifically in particular, not for the sake of trying to identify dysfunction with the way an individual's psychology is arranged in mental health, but more specifically, what can be done to improve the condition of people who already have healthy mental predispositions and mechanisms of coping with life. There's a decided lack of acknowledgement of people who are healthy with regards to that as it pertains to mental health, which I think creates a situation where the context of this conversation is only seen in general in some sort of negative disease-based paradigm, where just the mere mention of mental health carries with it the insinuation that something is wrong, or there's some sort of attempt to try to prove that nothing's wrong. And it becomes an exercise in missing the point. There are, in essence, entirely too few illustrations of what it looks like when somebody is truly healthy. And that is profoundly unfortunate. What I wanted to do originally was show one of my previous videos that I had put forward in my fictional content, as I think I covered one of the points that I wanted to bring up with regards to my response to the point Black Pill Therapy put forward, which is this idea of Afro Surrealism. He kind of describes it as a means by which the mind finds a way to cope with the essential gaslighting that occurs with regards to dealing with this word black in the context of race in America and the psychological runoff of what you create to articulate your experience with regards to it. And it comes off as a kind of surrealism, this pseudo reality that you find yourself dealing with and coping with. And even though it appears as though you're the only one who sees it, it's odd because there's a kind of collective delusion that everyone plays along with, almost like being in the Twilight Zone. You could almost describe it as being in a dreamlike state. This is a big reason why I wanted to present this term. Yume no mata yume. In the circle of training that I come from, This is a very important concept that describes this idea of surrealism to a degree. It is an acknowledgement of the fundamental illusory nature of reality, followed by the illusory nature of our senses. And that for all that we have within our five senses, still, we aren't necessarily absorbing everything to do with reality. We make approximations of the environment, of the situation we find ourselves in. And it's from this perspective we've gathered through our five senses that we create an approximation of the illusion that's presented towards us in this construct that we call the now. When enough people agree with the illusions that we've acquired, we call this reality. But there's so many flaws that come along with that understanding. Even when we have the phenomenon of dreams, there's a very popular axiom in this discipline where one day an individual had a dream that they were a butterfly. And when they awoke, they asked a very simple question. Am I a human who just had a dream of being a butterfly? Or in this illusory state that I call reality, am I a butterfly who is dreaming of being a human? It's from this disposition that the illusory nature of reality is called into question. And so this idea of trying to strip away the fundamental constructs that an individual has utilized to form their identity of I is removed to recognize the fundamental understanding of the universal oneness one has with everything. It's in removing these illusions that one can get to the true essence of what the self is. And it's from here that true honesty can be made realized, and you can begin to really experience the now. Getting out of one's way to experience what is. That idea we talked about before of makoto, or truth. This is the reminder of Yume no mata Yume. I'll get a little bit more into that in just a minute, and we'll tie this into the general point and metaphor that I want to use before we get into the real details in my response to Black Pill therapy. But as I addressed and looked into this idea of Afro Surrealism, these are the energy that animated the thoughts that came forward as a result. But before I go any further, I'm going to take some time to open up the dojo properly and give a few acknowledgments of folks who are here right now. Firstly, to the founders of the space, os. To those of you in the chat and the replay who have joined me in the dojo, os. This is the nameless protagonist. Like to acknowledge Shango Zulu, os. Glad you can make it today, fam. We've got VJ here, os. Spain Man, os. Vernon King, os. Got Miss Unicorn, os. Toya the Tutor, os. Deshaun, Os. Tahuti of New Kemet, Os and Hotep. Toko, Os. 7 Cupid, Os. Grab Second Gear Eddie, Os. Bud Buddies, Os. Let's see, Unicorn says, a human remembering who you may have been in a past life. Butterfly, a great symbol to express change and transformation. That is such a profound metaphor for apotheosis and metamorphosis, followed by the nature of one's place in the grand wheel of change, where the actions of one can amalgamate to profound change over time. There's so much to this metaphor of the butterfly, where I may get into that one day in and of itself. It deserves its own conversation. That is absolutely correct. There's a lot to acknowledge there. McDrama Bear, os. And definitely, if you guys can, it helps a lot to hit the like button on the way in and subscribe if you haven't already. This assists me in the algorithm so I can get this message out to guys, that anybody in general who may need it. And definitely feel free to share. Got Ibo Sosa. Ohayo gozaimasu. Os. It's lagging for me on StreamYard, so I can't click you yet. But there you go. Os. But getting to this idea of Yume no mata yume, there are a few poems I want to put forward that kind of set the tone for what I'm talking about. Let me find it real quick. I had it set, but I don't know why the page disappeared on me. A few technical difficulties, and I'll be right with you. Okay, here we are. This is from Dogen Shobo Ginzo. He was the individual responsible for offering a particular understanding of Zen to Japan. And contrary to popular belief, a lot of people believe that Zen was a big deal with samurai, but samurai only lately, with regards to their relationship to understanding the way of the warrior, got involved after conflict was resolved, since a great deal of Zen involves this idea of zazen, or sitting and contemplating the way of what is. Many samurai did not have the time to simply sit down and consider these ideas. And so it's really only in passing and only in retirement did the samurai find great use for Zen in general. There were, of course, exceptions with the warrior monks, or those who were known as sohe. They managed to find ways of implementing the martial science with the idea of Zen, much like those in the Shaolin Temple ultimately did, which is where much of Zen is accredited in general. There's a man named Shoten Doji, a man rumored to have been from India, but when you see pictures of him, looks like the typical melanated individual you would expect from the continent of Africa. He was also an outcast to those who were practicing at the time. And it was while he was on what we described as Musha Shugyo, only not the warrior version of it, but one who sought to understand the way of the world by wandering it. He found himself in isolation for over 10 years, and when he exited the cave, the instant enlightenment, or satori, that he experienced provided a whole new way of looking at many of the teaching in sutra. And it's from there this line of Zen was born. Implementing it with various postures and techniques that are familiar to the martial arts and martial science, it was able to rejuvenate a lot of the Hindi practice, which gave rise to the way it was practiced in southern China. And from there, it made its way to Japan. These ideas of understanding the way of what is, contemplating the present moment, and meditating on the meaning of death so that one is not consumed by it are all concepts inherent to this, which the samurai didn't adopt at first, but much later, when war subsided during the Tokugawa era, became a foremost tenet to realizing the way of what is. It was in this context that it became popular that when one was close to facing death, that this idea of revisiting this concept of Yume no mata Yume was presented forward. Dogen Shobo Ginzo presents the idea first as this. Therefore, when those who doubt the Buddhist way encounter, quote, disclosing a dream within a dream, they foolishly think that it has to do with whether or not a dream of grass actually exists, or that it is like illusion mounted on top of illusion. But this is not the case. Even though illusion is compounded within illusion, you must understand that the path to attaining the way is realized through illusion surpassing illusion. To go beyond that which has been presented to you, to go beyond that which you understand what is. This is the idea of Yume no mata Yume. As understood by one of the first samurai to interpret this understanding, we have Chikamatsu Sonzenkai. On his deathbed, he writes, "Farewell to this world, and to the night farewell. We who walk the road of death, to what should we be likened? To the frost by the road that leads to the graveyard, vanishing with each step, we take ahead. How sad, this dream within a dream." One more from Toyotomi Hideyoshi, one of the greatest known samurai who was responsible for the invasion of Korea. It is said he embodied the idea of the samurai so greatly that he believed it was all about conquest. Yet, in the wake of his failure, having gotten ahead of himself, he failed to take Korea and had to return back to Japan and consider his actions. He too, on his deathbed, wrote, "Like a dew I came, like dew I go. My life and all I have done at Osaka is just a dream within a dream." Dealing with the fragility of existence and recognizing its subjectivity. Human beings have always found ways of trying to cope with this phenomenon. It's why I find this idea of Afro Surrealism so very relatable. There's a way it needs to be articulated. It's not the same. An illustration of this that was brilliant that was offered was Danny Glover's video. When you go through the scenes and, it begins with that shot, and the police officers showing up, people dancing in that abandoned building. These concepts, these motifs centered around being Black, our experience here. It's kind of like a suspension of reality. It's as if you're watching some sort of strange movie where we grow up understanding that fundamentally we inherently, intrinsically know we're human, but then to learn that there's this augmentation of Blackness that is projected onto you that almost in a sense shapes your destiny. It's as if we go through this phase of trying to defy that by any means necessary. We deal with it in an internal sense, and we deal with it in our home environment. We turn on the television, which augments our reality, so to speak. We view our media, and we ask the question, what does Black even mean? We go through these experiences, which most of us share and understand. We have a moment where we learn we're Black. That in itself is very unusual. And unusual in the sense of there's a schism that occurs in the psyche, which I intend to talk about. That schism that highlights, sure, you are human. Sure, you may even be an American citizen. But there's this additional part, this collective illusion we all need to participate in. And it does influence your life. And for as much as many of us may try to argue contrary, there are a lot of very important life decisions many of us may have made in the past predicated purely on the fact that we have this classification. Being cognizant of it. It's part of that Afro Surrealism that's being described. And it's interesting in how it essentially is almost exactly like a mask. I wanted to bring up the idea of the kitsune or the fox demon. And I wanted to tie this into the concept of Yume no mata Yume, because oftentimes the fox demon is used as a means to describe this concept. For those who don't know, in Japanese culture, the kitsune or fox demon is part of a family of entities known as yokai. Yokai are, you could call them spirits that share a spectrum between benevolent and malevolent. But they have a few interesting characteristics. It is of my subjective opinion and my experience with Ninpo in ninjutsu that yokai represent personality concepts that are inherent and intrinsic to human nature, that are reflected in the form of spirits. They are, in other words, various kinds of psychological profiles that can be akin and likened to dispositions of human behavior. One of the interesting characteristics of the kitsune is its tendency to be pranksters. They involve themselves in human affairs, in particular, the female ones. They're stated to have the ability to bewitch people and convince them of various illusions. They are also, in fact, masters of illusion. They have the power of foxfire, which can cause many things, from great damage to being able to convince people of various things. If you're familiar with the intellectual property Naruto, the 9 tails fox demon, or the QB, as it's stated, Q representing 9, B in being tail. The QB kitsune is one of the most noble expressions of the kitsune. Their whole center of story revolves around being able to transform into humans, and at times having short-term and long-term relationships with them. There's often parables about how a farmer would be wishing for a wife, and in their rice field, they may have come across a fox that was injured, and they help that fox. Later on, that fox comes back in the form of a beautiful woman, and the farmer and that fox end up getting married. And the thing is, there's always something off about her. A tail may show up on occasion. During a full moon, part of the fox's actual real form may reveal itself. And the catch is generally, so long as that person that's involved with the fox doesn't recognize this or see it, they can go their whole life not knowing that they have a relationship with the fox, even to the point of having children. There are folk tales that talk about how this is how you get children that have bloodlines connected to that. And a lot of omnyodo or omnyoji, their occult sciences, are tied to entire families that may have bloodlines connected to them. But the catch is, should they ever discover the origin of the ancestor, or should that farmer ever discover the true nature of the wife, they irrevocably disappear. And the story speaks to the illusory nature of what it is they accomplished together. The kitsune puts on a mask. That mask creates something that's seen and experienced to a degree as real. It really begs the question, how real are the things that are around you with regard to that? If a fox can put a mask on and the two can have a happy engagement, a marriage, a family, all it takes is for that mask to be removed for it all to be torn to pieces. How real was it to start with? And how many other things in our everyday life are just like this? That touches into a very major aspect of Jungian psychology. And I want to use this to transition into part of what I wanted to bring up with this idea of dual consciousness. Much of what we understand with this concept of Afro Surrealism is like placing a mask on. We have a deep, inherent, intrinsic nature endemic of ourselves. Yet we have to create these masks as a means of interfacing with the reality that we've been presented to, known as the American society. With it comes a set of presuppositions and ideologies that may or may not have anything to do with who we even really are. Animated by what we understand from our culture, our direct line of effect. I speak about this in Sword Form 3 when I get into the Demon Gate and describe how various cultures are shaped by the collective experience the group of people the culture belong to have undergone, and the way in which they've decided to, across the board, solve their problems and cope with the base needs of reality. It's from these seeds that we get the fundamental understanding of personalities that match the goal and the temperament of the culture from which we belong. If within it, this schism, this dualism is inherent to survive, it becomes part of the cultural identity, and thus the mask of being Black is handed to you as a means of coping with the reality from which we come from. It is in turn a kind of dual consciousness. I want to draw attention to this point. We can go forward from there. I've got a link here. Go ahead and share this in the chat with you. While I'm doing that, I'll make a couple more acknowledgments since we have a few more people who've made their way in. Let's see. We have first we got Tootie Kemet, excellence correspondence with a butterfly, animal association, associations to concepts more easily convey meaning. Yes, symbols in general say a lot, a whole lot. Got Clarence Everett. Os. Appreciate you, fam. Glad you can make it. Shugyo is a Buddhist practice. Indeed. Dave Tao. Os. What's good, fam? Good morning to you. Unsunken One. Os. Chef Mike's Round Table says os to the chat. Os to you, fam. We got Indigo Flow. Os. QB Kitsune. Indeed. It's beguiling. I got AB Media. Os. Sheed we hear. Os. He said, is it a mask we wear, or is it the lens through which others view us based on history? I think there's a kind of mutual, how do I want to describe this? It almost becomes a chicken or the egg thing. I think initially we simply are what we are. And when we don that mask, I believe it's in response to the environment. I think we identify with it because it produces results and it assists in coping. It's kind of like when we place a jacket on. We know that we don't develop fur. And so we've acquired the jacket to adapt to the environment under which we find ourselves. I think the key here is when we find ourselves in an environment that's a rainforest, having the jacket on to protect us from the cold needs to be called into question, because it's not the mask that's so much the issue. It's the presuppositions that are front-loaded about the mask that cause the harm. So being Black isn't the issue. It's the presuppositions attached to being Black that become the issue. And so many don't consider the reason for which the mask was created to start with. It has its uses, it has its function, and it has its purpose in this environment. But if you take so much time to be caught up in identifying with the jacket, you miss the reason as to what you really are. You fail to understand what you are. Hopefully that answers the nature of what I'm describing here. Indeed. Let's see. It says, I am not who I think I am. I am not who you think I am. I am who I think you think I am. Yeah, there's a third step that's sort of removed where people project what they believe they see onto you. And there's an interesting way our mirror neurons acquiesce to that, where we infer our self-image and self-understanding from the projections that other place upon us. It's why I have an axiom that I've placed into the Tao of dissonance, this philosophy I'm piecing together, which really states about this concept of presupposition and how one can only sever themselves from the chains of presupposition with the blade that is forged from self-acceptance. It gives so much credence to this term, know thyself. That is not an easy thing to do. All right, let's see. We've got present, share screen, window, and there we go. Afro Surrealism. Let's see, can you guys see this pretty well? Looks like it's showing up pretty reasonably here. Let's see if we can zoom in a bit. Let's see. All right. So the tightrope of our hope. These are the words that Afro-Caribbean writer Suzanne Césaire used to describe the Surrealist movement in 1943. Let's see. They say contemporarily Afro Surrealist. There's an additional opposition that the movement seeks to treat. The future, past, a point of time suspended precariously between what has been and what will be. They say the future, past is right now. And this was essentially addressing some aspects of what I call the superposition between the past and the future is the present moment. And it's making an attempt to, I guess, try to internalize and develop a point of reference to make sense of everything that's going on. And it kind of gives the birth to this idea. Goes on to say, what does it mean to be living in America right now while Black? It is a moment both informed by a troubled past and a precarious future. The sentiment rings true for St. Louis, a city facing 12 federal lawsuits following brutal mass arrests that took place during the protests, which erupted after the Stokely verdict in 2017. From stop and frisk policies to racially motivated, I'm gonna call them Karen calls, and from other racial profiling, which is prevalent in society today. Black Americans are continuously policed simply by race and appearance. This is why the mission of exposing the quote right now is crucial. They go on to state there's no need for tomorrow's tongues speculating about the future. Concentration camps, bombed out cities, famines, and forced sterilization have already happened. To the Afro Surrealists, the tasers are here. The four horsemen rode through too long ago to recall. And I think that's the important aspect to really highlight. You know, at the end of the day, our demographic kind of experiences a canary in the coal mine sort of scenario. We experience the things that many people speak about being concerned with. They're worried about the idea of where the country is headed. But we exist in this odd time space where we're already here in the future. It's why I talk so much about futurism and the consequences of the fourth industrial wave. This phenomenon of modernization as it pertains to human beings. We experience these things first disproportionately because the cultural resistance that's supposed to be in place for us has been stripped long ago. I still make the argument that the overwhelming majority of what can be decisively described as African American history was found and abandoned. Hoodoo with an H was abandoned. We find a lot of aspects of hoodoo built into various institutions that helped us cope on the plantation, such as the church, such as the midwife position, such as the medicine man, which we don't hear about anymore, even down to the lawyer once we got out. But these things have essentially disappeared into fragments of behavioral predispositions, and more of it is being amalgamated and hoarded by so-called folk peoples that are overrepresented in the South, and maybe even some of the hill folks that live in parts of the East Coast and the mountains and whatnot. These things have largely disappeared. The boomers who were supposed to have learned a lot of those techniques from the silent generation got rid of it, saw it as superstition a lot of times. Or it's so baked into some aspects of music that we don't even realize, like jazz, that you just disappear in the background, leaving only a shadow in some of the churches that you go to on a regular basis, but that the overwhelming majority of men have abandoned long ago because they've forgotten that spirit of High John. Little research on that if you guys don't know who he is. But we still do see that play out in some other ways, but it's very subconscious. The point I'm making is African American culture, as it would qualify, has largely been displaced and appropriated by other groups of people who've migrated here. Very little of it remains. And as a result, it's left us without a means by which we can truly address and find our needs met in a healthy capacity, leaving us to experience this idea of dual consciousness. Now, this is taken from the National Library of Medicine. And I wanted to present this because, it examines it in the context of patriotism. And I think it's a good way of highlighting it because I like the point it makes here. And this is a study of the paradox of Black patriotism, double consciousness. I first came across this idea from Amos Wilson, where he describes a dual consciousness. And he was building on the idea presented by W.E.B. Du Bois, who talks about this idea of a dual consciousness. But we'll read the abstract here because I think it really hits home to the point. Let me zoom in, see if you guys can see this a bit better. And I will share this resource. Also, all of these resources are available in the description for your notes that you can go back and research. And save it for your own records. All right. It says this study explores the double consciousness of Black American patriotism in the modern era, marked by publicized police killings of Blacks, widespread anti-racism protests, and concern for racially motivated violence. This analysis provides timely ethnographic insights into Black identities that vividly captures Black voices, fuses classical and contemporary race theories, and extends them to the literature on patriotism, and proposes a model for understanding how double consciousness is negotiated in personal identity construction. I conducted 22 in-depth interviews of Black Americans. I explored 3 questions: how they interpret patriotism, whether their interpreters affirm or defy their Black identity, and how tensions between race and nation manifest their patriotic identity development. Many denounce hegemonic patriotism and constructed alternative patriotic brands. These brands are situated in an axis of identities, which comprised of 4 profiles: the bystander, the sycophant, the subverter, and the conscious patriot. I'd like to take a look at these first few paragraphs because I think they sum up what we're talking about here. And we'll move on to the next. On July 4th, 2016, America celebrated Independence Day, a national holiday featuring patriotic symbols and rituals that valorize history, traditions, and ideals of the nation. Shortly after midnight, with fireworks bursting throughout the country, Alton Sterling, a 37-year-old Black man, was forcibly tackled to the ground and shot multiple times at point-blank range by 2 white police officers in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. He died wearing a patriotic red polo shirt. Less than 48 hours later, on July 6th, Philandro Castile, a 32-year-old Black man, was fatally shot multiple times in front of his fiancée and 4-year-old daughter by a Hispanic police officer in Minnesota. Both men were allegedly killed for circumstances involving possession of a firearm in states where citizens have the right to carry concealed arms. The videos of their deaths were publicized, drawing international attention and triggering widespread protests. On July 7, 2016, at the close of peaceful protests against the killings of Sterling and Castile, Micah Xavier Johnson shot 12 police officers, 2 civilians, killing 5 of the officers in Dallas, Texas. Johnson was an Army Reserve Afghan war veteran who was reportedly incensed over the recent police shootings of Black men. According to sources, the shooting was the deadliest incident for U.S. law enforcement since the terrorist attacks on 11 September 2001, given that a Black war veteran, an icon of patriotism, would target and kill white police officers. Another patriotic figure was an alleged act of retaliation against racism, exposes the potential tensions and nuances between allegiance to race and allegiance to nation. The preponderance of race scholarship diagnoses contemporary American society as one marked by systematic racism, which encrypted the mainstream framing of citizenship and patriotism, proposed that Blacks internalized racism in their identity development, experiencing a double consciousness, one soul striving to be American, one soul striving to be Black. This study ethnographically explores the paradoxes of Black patriotism, loyalty, service, and other American patriotic sentiments expressed by Blacks or African Americans in the present era of publicized police killings of Black Americans, and how this double consciousness is negotiated in identity construction. I find that the double consciousness is negotiated in an axis of identities, which defines the typology of patriotic profiles. The double consciousness. You know, just to bridge the point so I can continue to the next iteration I want to describe, it kind of reminds me of Anansi's speech on the slave ship in American Gods, where he talks about what's going to happen. And it begs the question of, is it worth it living as though you are dead? In a sense where, yeah, you're alive, but you'll never be African. Human beings require a sense of self to make sense of the world around them. And as understood and articulated by both Dr. Neely Fuller and Dr. Francis Cress Welsing with the ISIS papers, Dr. Neely Fuller describes whiteness as a classification. Other individuals classified as white offer themselves. And Dr. Francis Cress Welsing brings the psychological and biological reality of this in the fact that whiteness is something that is genetically recessive. Thus, white plus white equals white. White plus any other thing besides white is classified as non-white. When you combine those two, the end result is non-white. As a result, what you are left with is a mutually exclusive classification to which individuals classified as black serve as an antithesis. It in turn places you in a perpetual state of being in the outgroup, because the natural reaction human beings have used to solve this, which is the modality of empathy, isn't realized, because to accept blackness is to accept the disappearance of this classification of white. So we're forever stuck in this cultural limbo where whiteness has been made synonymous with citizenship. And thus you are doomed to never truly be accepted, not so long as the definition of white exists, which leads to my statement and assessment of this blackness. And that black in this context is nothing more than the shadow of white. And wherever you go that a definition of white exists, black exists as its shadow. So if you're ever going to assert any sort of change, you have to decouple this from whiteness. And that's just not possible for a shadow. That's the trap we find ourselves in. That's the negative predisposition that this schism leads us subjective to. And it's where we find ourselves with this dual consciousness. I can't even begin to explain the problems this creates with regards to coping with reality. The holes that are left behind in trying to address it. But I think this space, at least for men, has a unique opportunity in front of itself to try to begin to address that. With the verbal martial art that I've been creating, the very first verbal sword form deals with social dominance order, social dominance theory. It highlights the difference in the way men and women are treated with regards to this modality of classification, this third arbitrary set discrimination, where men are the disproportionate recipients of negativity with regards to power, and how the overwhelming majority of negativity that women who share our classification experience. They experience the nuclear fallout of the nukes that have been targeted towards black men. The consequences of their actions, or rather, the consequences of what has occurred to us trickle to them because they are adjacent to us. And it leaves them in a position to where they are chronically exposed. The end result is a liability placed on black men to create a safe environment. But we find ourselves grossly unable to do so because we don't have the cultural modalities to create the institutions that would be required to push back. We're subject to trying to integrate into a system where, yes, we can code switch and find ourselves involved in some of these institutions. But we still have to deal with the reality that we are the physical embodiment of their antithesis. We are the physical embodiment of what can erase and replace them. Again, as Dr. Francis Cress Welsing has highlighted, keeping the eye on the black ball. It's that genetic potential that can remove all of that. And it's that interaction with the one most protected demographic in this country, and that is females classified as white. I want to shift to some potential answers in response to what the Brother Black Pill Therapy was talking about. Let me find this section here I was looking for. Go here instead. So there's this concept that was introduced from Maslow. And it began from a pushback against Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung, wanting to push an idea understood as humanistic psychology. And I think it's important because it moves away from viewing mental health as just this attempt to match symptom to diagnosis and then just throwing people under the bus with medications to try to deal with depression, essentially, or whatever other modality that's going on that's interfering with the behavior. There isn't enough consideration for people's real, actual needs and what it looks like when somebody isn't in this compromised position and actually healthy. Let me go to, there we are. There it is, as a brief reminder of what this looks like. You know, I refer to this constantly. Let me see if I can get rid of this bottom part. You guys can see this pretty well. Go here and okay. All right, cool. So I talk about this in Sword Form 3 when I get into what puts people in a position of depending on the demon gate. In other words, going into their shadow functions to get their needs met, and how the culture helps provide means by which these modalities are addressed. Now, understand that these bottom four functions are what's required for a human being to healthily cope with reality. Our experience on the plantation robbed us of agency to address physiological needs and our safety. And it's left us disproportionately overemphasizing that once we left that plantation. We view success in raising children as fitting one of those two categories. One, we hear these terms, I put a roof over your head and I gave you food. That's what these two things really symbolize. Many people think that they're done raising their kids if they provide these two things. We talk about child support court, how the argument is being able to provide these things here. We get individuals that become successful later on in life. And then what are they getting as signs of success? Nothing that are in these other two. Generally speaking, there are overexpressions of what we experience in these bottom two. overemphasizing things related to this, overemphasizing things related to success here. I think it's important because it speaks to a lot of the addictions that we find ourselves associated with. Such an overemphasis on safety leaves us in a position to where, yeah, we did it to cope, but we're effectively traumatized still because that was violated on the plantation. That was violated once we left the plantation. That was violated during Jim Crow. That was violated during civil rights. That was violated during the crack era. That was violated during this era with regards to this war on terror and all of this nonsense and what's going on with the over policing of the communities we live in. Violated in the house when we don't have stable 2-parent households that can provide that baseline physical safety, because maybe we got dudes running in and out the house all the damn time, and this is the precursor to abuse. All of these things play out to where if you remove yourself from that environment, now you need over expressions of these things just to feel normal. Being in chronic poverty, now all of a sudden we've got folks indulging in food, overeating. And I don't just mean doing it for the sake of it. I mean literally overeating outside of food deserts. People who plenty of money. Or we've got material things that represent these physiological needs being expressed. Signs of wealth, material possessions, the hoarding of these things to excess. All for the sake of communicating that you have a stable ability to acquire resources. And it's kind of funny when you see people who do have abundant resources in general. You can tell that when it's baked into the culture, you'd look at them and they damn near look like homeless people. You get folks who come out of these environments where they're chronically inundated with scarcity, and they're walking around here blinging, flashing hard as I don't know what. But then you look at our demographic and it makes sense, because on these plantations, what would have people, especially the women, seen? These folks pulling up in these carriages, fancy horses, this planter class Southern belle visage with the white gloves on that go all the way up halfway past the forearm. It's big ass fancy floral belle, Southern belle hats, long gowns, jewelry just blinging extra hard. And here goes some house Negro walking up to the carriage, opening the door for her, like there's some sort of European aristocracy from the 1500s. You think that went away somewhere? We're talking about the schism. Meanwhile, these two things which were denied and continue to be denied end up being overexpressed and overemphasized in these bottom two. Meanwhile, these top two that are also required for coping with life, to be a normal functioning human being, coping with life, these two just get thrown by the wayside, seen as optional or transactional. So here we are with the typical experience being individuals are born and there's this emphasis of, I paid for a roof over your head and I fed you. I gave you clothes on your back. The children are being held liable for this damn near. It's as if the kids got to pay for the fact that they were born, that it's an inconvenience that the parents are providing these baseline two things for them. Meanwhile, these two things are seen as optional. Belonging and love. Followed by esteem. I can say with confidence that the overwhelming majority of our demographic get these two things from people who don't even look like us. And if we get it so rarely from those that look like us It's even more so rare to get that from within your family. To the point where those of you who actually did, you know more than one person who didn't. And it may sound alien to you that folks grow up without these two things. But this is the common denominator, especially in our demographic. We don't have these things endemic and inevitable with regards to people who look like we do. If we get it, it's conditional. It's predicated on something we've done or not done. These things are supposed to be unconditional. They are just as required as these two. And like somebody told me recently, I really would have flipped this upside down. I think it should be the other way around with regards to how important these things are, because I really don't think you get these without having the rest of this in place. But that's another conversation. The point is, just by having these two things doesn't necessarily mean you get these two. And I think that's very important. And we're seeing the effects of that right now. Dr. Frances Cress Welsing talks about it when she describes lap time. If you don't get it from the family members you're supposed to, you go seek other places to acquire that. And that especially hits hard with women. I can tell you right now, the overwhelming majority of men growing up do not get this from their immediate family setting. They have to learn how to somehow compensate that for themselves, or they grow up believing they're not deserving of it. A lot of women grow up having kids just so they can have something to try to project that onto because they didn't get that. Go talk to a lot of mothers now. Go listen to what a lot of Black women are saying why they have kids. Because they didn't get this, and they think that if they have kids, they can get it somehow. And they were never even taught what that looks like. Meanwhile, the kids are growing up seeing this empty void in their parents, particularly their mothers, with no idea on how to actually even address that. And then they turn on the TV, and there's no goddamn way they're even getting a piece of this right here. Do you know how ridiculously contradictory it is to try to develop this in the environments we come out of? And the only way we ever really get that is by consuming the esteem of other people. In other words, we have to destroy somebody else to feel good about ourselves. And it's seen in this weird way of, oh, well, we strengthen them because steel sharpens steel. I'm going to sit here and cut this motherfucker down and Joan on him and roast this motherfucker. And then he's going to have this thick skin so he can deal with the world outside. That's how we going to build you up. That might work in functional environments where you have a recovery system. The problem with that, it's like lifting weights, but you have no rest days. You're not even eating right. So you're not getting a proper protein profile. So protein synthesis isn't even happening. You're just in a constant state of inflammation. So yeah, go ahead and get joning on. But what happens when you come home? Boy, I work hard and I put this roof over your head and I gave you this food. You're going to eat this. Or, oh, you don't want that? This not enough for you? Go get a job. Damn what you've done in school. Damn the fact that you made sure your brothers and sisters made it home safe that day. Damn the fact that you prevented one of your friends from getting clapped over some bullshit. Damn the fact that you avoided getting arrested by police because you happened to be at the right place at the right time. Damn all of that. And here we go. Now we got somebody going to school. You got bobos on your feet. You don't have shoes like that. You don't have attire like that. And here you are getting joined on in school by these kids. You over here getting curbed and carried all day. And then people want to act brand new when somebody just snaps because they said the wrong goddamn thing at the wrong time. Oh, but you an adult. You conscious. You supposed to know this already, fam. Coping mechanisms with life. These were never optional. These were required to be a healthy human being. For all it's worth, for as much of this as you get, if you don't get this to accompany it, quite frankly, it's nothing more than another form of abuse. And don't think that just because you left the house, this stops. Remember, this is baked into the culture. And because it's baked into the culture, this is the predisposition. We just had a situation recently. I think it was in Virginia. Well, the brother was being bullied. They're in college now. 3 football athletes bullying this brother. He talks to his dad. His dad's like, well, you ain't got but 1 more year, son. Just, you can hold out and you can deal with it. Gave him that pastor preacher advice. That hashtag deal with it. Like he's had to do his whole damn life. No recovery. And eventually he snaps. And what happens? They call it a mass shooting, but it was only mass shooting by definition because more than 2 people were killed. 3 other black dudes were targeted, and they were all related to this dude in connection with bullying him. And then we got the morality police coming in, repelling from the damn ceiling. You shouldn't have done it, blah, blah, blah. There's no goddamn help for these brothers. There's no coping mechanism that's being taught here besides this plantation Jesus turn the other cheek bullshit. And this isn't an attack on Christians. I think it's more of an examination of what's actually written in that book. Because ain't nothing wrong with that book. Ain't nothing wrong with that book at all. That same book is what helped Constantine conquer planet Earth. And that same book was used to enslave an entire group of people across all the developed West. That ain't them words in there. It's how it's being disseminated and taught. That is a very human thing. And the culture is supposed to be what prepares you to cope with these things. It's why I put so much emphasis on these bottom 4 here, in particular these top 2, because we are uniquely starved of these things. And this is becoming a habit across the board for human beings in the developed West overall. It isn't just us anymore. It's becoming a great number of people. Many of us have to learn how to acquire these things in our adulthood. And then we have to backwards compensate by looking back into the families and the homes that we came from. And from the excess of what we've acquired from this, try to pour back into our immediate families so that they can stop that cycle as well. It's not an easy thing. It's not an easy thing. It's possible. But it's speaking to that point. This is why I want to bring more attention to these things, getting into, humanistic psychology. I'll read this last little bit because I know Roger's streaming now. I don't want to hold you guys. We're approaching. We went past the hour mark. So let me get into this first couple paragraphs. It says honoring the whole person. And again, this is talking about humanistic psychology. During the first half of the 20th century, American psychology was dominated by psychoanalysis, followed later by behaviorism. Neither school fully acknowledged qualities of human potential. or the study of values, intentions, and meaning in human experience. There was need for a new paradigm that celebrated the inherent value and dignity of human beings. That paradigm was to be called humanistic psychology. Humanistic psychology was a, quote, third force, which had its beginnings in Detroit in the early 1950s. And it was here at MSP that co-founder Clark Mostax, Abraham Maslow, the one that was responsible for the pyramid I just showed you guys, Carl Rogers, and others first met to discuss the humanistic tenets for self-actualization, health, creativity, intrinsic nature. Key right here. Intrinsic nature. Being, becoming, individuality, and meaning. The humanistic psychological orientation is a contemporary and integrative school of thought which centers tenets of the humanistic approach to psychotherapy, which includes fostering greater capacities for self-awareness and understanding of relationships with others, strengthening relational bonds, clarification and development of values, personal meaning and life goals, promotion of an environment of mutual care, respect and empathy. We go right here again. Development of a greater sense of personal freedom and choice while respecting the rights and needs of others. The interests of humanistic psychology include the aspirations of individuals, their goals, desires, fears, potential for and actualizing of personal growth, and qualities of empathy, congruence, authenticity, presence, and intimacy, experience of loss, tragedy, and pain, which are understood as reflecting basic issues concerning the nature of the self, existence, and one's engagement with the world. Humanistic psychology aims to be faithful to the full range of human experience. Its foundations also include philosophical humanism, existentialism, and phenomenology. It goes on to kind of break down a lot of these things, and it shows, some of these tenets that are associated with it. But I think it's something that's missing. The idea of really breaking down psychology, not just as a means of disease diagnoses, but recognizing and engaging in behavior that provides meaning and context to being human. And this is where we get into those higher portions of the pyramid. Your mind, your cognitive consciousness with regards to interfacing with the world around you, appreciating what you can do with concepts like art. And we're learning that art is a deep form of human expression and therapy. We're learning how important it is to be involved in some form of art, and that it actually helps contextualize your experiences in being human. So much so that I'd almost put it down here. I really think this pyramid needs to be rearranged, because these things are far more important now than they ever were, in an era where these needs are being met as a baseline through the fourth industrial wave. These higher functions in the pyramid are more and more important because they're what are being sacrificed for the sake of these two. You can go through right now and see how painting is used as a backdoor means of solving problems that the conscious mind isn't equipped to deal with, but is latent within the subconscious mind. And it provides a means by which to express and correct that, which opens the gate for self-actualization, because you're coming to understand and know yourself. And it leads to this top portion here, which Maslow didn't get a lot of time to really flesh out. But a lot of our original indigenous culture dealt with exclusively and from the very beginning through the form of initiation. Shout out to Rael. Transcendental experiences. And I can say right now, I've been contacted by a lot of you guys on the low, and I plan on talking about this more specifically. The importance of transcendental experience and how I really think it's a rebooting of this whole entire pyramid. Your transcendental experience gives you the context to reinterpret and understand everything else we just finished talking about. Because there's a difference between the way your life is before and after, and how it is an integral part of being human. That transcendental experience. Going back to what I said in the very onset about Yume no mata Yume, the dream within the dream. The goal, as was said in the first poem from Dogen, when he described transcending the illusion. In a few words, it's all surreal. Afro surreal. But I'll go ahead and wind down on this since we're approaching the 1.5 hour mark. We'll go ahead and go through a few of you guys' statements. Let's see. Well, you guys had quite a bit to say. Life of Pablo says Atlanta does a really good interpretation of Afro Surrealism, in my opinion. I absolutely co-sign. Yeah, before that he says, oh yeah, shout out to you, Evo Sosa. I'm way behind. Let me get up here. Okay, that was the last one I addressed. He says, oh yeah, I addressed that too. Says, watching the moment, I knew my son knew he was, quote, black, filled me with pride regarding his intelligence, then quickly turned into sorrow for what the implications are. Yeah, shout out to the doll test, man. Says the nameless teacher. I appreciate that, fam. Says it's so complicated and conflicting when you really come to the understanding. Yep. Yeah, Ebo, anytime, fam. You already know where I'm at. Ubuntu. I'm reminded of that parable. Man, shout out to the Bantu folks. I'm a person because there are people. Got Afro National. Os. King made a visit. Os. Indeed. Black community, canary in the coal mine. Let's see. Yeah, almost like the realization that you're not on the varsity team. How do you make them aware of the position society expects them to be, and while telling them to reject it? That's that dual consciousness we're talking about, man. Hoodoo is in rock and roll. Indeed it is. It's in a lot of American music created by individuals that look like me and you, which is why it's too difficult to replace. I remember reading 1984 and Animal Farm and was like, George Orwell must have been studying black history. The very things that people fear might happen has already happened to us. Man, that's the story. That's a day in the life of us, man. Real talk. In fact, a lot of these institutions, they go back to the continent or they observe our community so that they can see a lot of these principles they want to test within themselves. It's very common. In fact, a lot of these aspects of psychology were observed in indigenous tribes on the continent right now. Agreed. The saying goes that when Black America catches the flu, white America catches a cold. But I think it's the reverse because we're living in the future plane of existence. Yeah, I think a lot of our symptoms are just really unique in that we don't have that culture to serve as an immune system for us. It's just passing off a whole bunch of negative predispositions. So the Black church was born out of the practice of hoodoo. I done got excited. Yeah, that's another conversation. I might have that conversation with you, Unicorn, because I don't think people know of what hoodoo is. I think just having a convo on traditional African religion and the way it expresses itself in America would be interesting. Hoodoo in particular gets a pretty bad rap because it's misunderstood and conflated with other things that it's not. Yeah, man. Shout out to Anazi. This was so rough to sit through. Because for me, it killed that whole comply and you'll be fine. Nah, that was all shadow projection. That whole scene was shadow projection. And you see what kind of brother that was? Folks can miss me with this, we should have been committing a crime nonsense. It's all a lottery ticket thing. Says it does something to the psyche when you can see yourself in these brothers that meet such violent, tragic, unjust demise. I stopped even watching the videos. Yeah, man, it's unsettling. When you can see yourself in that, it is in a sense traumatic because you, in a sense, disassociate your mind with it. You disassociate yourself. It's a kind of displacement process that happens. I don't even think I saw the George Floyd video except for the clips, more or less. Couldn't avoid it until I watched the trial. And even then, I simply refuse anymore. Definitely understandable. Mbote Mpangi. Glad you can make it, fam. Also, shout out to Makandal. Man, I learned about that Bizongo life. I don't think folks are ready for that conversation. I'm gonna leave that alone. Shout out to the night. So those officers did Alton Sterling super dirty. Can only hope to live a long life. That's what most of us are at, fam. The double consciousness needs to be examined more, plus taught in the home to remove any unconscious thoughts of inferiority, strength, and unity. That's the whole purpose culture is supposed to have. I think bringing awareness to it is important. We talk about it colloquially. I got to look up the word I'm trying to say. It begins with a C and it sounds like that. But I'll just say symbolically, we articulate it as code switching. But there's some real consequences to that. Said Hichiriki faded out right on time. What's going on, Miss Bailey? Man, Spain, man, you ain't ever lie. Quotes Fred Hampton, quote, without education, people will accept anything. Without education, what you have is neo-colonialism instead of colonialism like you have now. I agree. I think Washington gets credited with that statement. A populace uninformed is a populace enslaved. So that kind of thinking makes me infuriating. Man. Yep, that hard reboot every single generation. We must have been talking about when I was bringing up the pyramid. For real, some parents think their kids owe them when the child never asked to be here. Fam, I can't talk about this enough. I can't. And that just gets passed down. It's that whole property parallel. So glad I didn't adopt that reasoning and saw the BS for what it was. Children didn't ask to be here and they don't raise themselves. Yeah, just because you've done those bottom two things doesn't mean that, you've done anything unique and special. It's just the responsibility you owe your children. The children don't owe you. You can go in nature right now and find some damn cats doing the same damn thing. That don't make you special. But I digress. My children refuse, and I'm conflicted about it. I'm happy they don't need to do that to feel good, but I'm worried about their interaction with other Black people down the line. You just got to be honest about the situation that's going on in totality, and them acquiring skills from the father when they get of age, I think is an important way to help temper some of that so they can get that exposure to the world around them with the father as the guide, and you reinforcing that in the household, providing those baseline materials that they can go out and learn a little bit more from, sitting down with them and watching documentaries, going together on little trips to maybe even visit museums and giving them the history in a way that relates to them. There's a couple ways that can kind of be tackled. And I know it can be challenging in the economic situation people find themselves in, but there definitely needs to be a counter narrative provided for in the house to address what they're learning in school and in the media, because they're being inundated with these messages on a subconscious level. So if you can stand as an exception to the rule and help equip them with those bottom 4 baseline coping mechanisms, I think it'll serve them properly in the long run rather than hinder. Indigo Flow says, just expressing my subjective opinion, fam. Says it's demoralizing when you see through how hollow the success stories are. Man, that part. And then they say you're hating when you point it out. It's ridiculous. Yeah, man. We need more mainstream focus on Black psychology. That's what I'm attempting to do. There's some folks who've contacted me on the low. So, and unbeknownst, my own inner circle has made this realization about the space. We're deficient in professionals that address mental health, that aren't animated by this gynocratic ideology, or who champion the tenets of intersectionalism. There's just too few. And I think that will help bring in context to this word empathy I'm trying to present to the space without it being seen as some declaration of victimhood or weakness. Because I don't know how you get trust without empathy. And yeah, we're in the middle of an exit strategy. But I think those two things are so critically important that without it, we don't get to where we say we need to get to. I don't see it. I just don't see it. Oh, she was talking about that Bible. Yep. That's not what folks are being taught on that plantation. They really go wild with this obey your master and turn the other cheek nonsense. Shout out to the books of Moses. If you know, you know. Vibration is the first law of nature. Humans, not the same vibratory frequency, can never work together in Black America. That is exactly it. And that the means by which vibration end up being on the same vibration in a constructive context is done through harmony. And to me, that's just another word for empathy. Feel more comfortable outside of Black America than inside it. It's unfortunately the same way I feel too, man. When I left pro-Blackism years ago, I felt so free because I didn't have the notion of saving Blacks anymore. It was draining. I don't know for me if it was the weight of trying to save anyone, because I learned a long time ago you can't help anybody that's not willing to help themselves. I think it's the weight of presupposition, that expectation that you're supposed to either serve as some form of grand sacrifice, and there's not even any tools that are being offered for you to even properly do that. it's so ridiculous and self-defeating. Black fathers and father figures are so important to instilling that pride and consciousness. Respect to my stepdad and mom's younger brother. You got to get it where you can find it, man. For me, it was in a dojo. He even had a moment where he was 4 or 5. He encountered racism and was able to identify it. Yeah, man, that moment you learn, we all have a story about it. Yeah, I agree. Indeed. Shout out to that too. It's the highest ideal and give ultimate perspective, the view from the top of the mountain. That's another conversation. That's another conversation. I'm gonna put a pause on that. It's breaking down some anecdotes. So the hoodoo convo was enlightening, albeit brief. Got to research, especially since y'all mentioned blues and rock and roll. Oh yeah, fam. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. You want to get started, man? Go take a look at what's called the Congo Cross, and I think you're gonna find a lot of interesting correlations behind what was going on in the Kikongo and how it relates directly to African Americans in ways that aren't being told. We'll just say that there's a connection with the Kikongo to Kemet, and there's a connection with the Kikongo to specifically African Americans who came in from the South, in particular Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. There is a interesting correlation. I'm gonna leave it at that. Same note, I wonder if there's a connection between ring shouting, buck jump dancing. Oh yeah, again, Congo cross. And pay attention to the Amduat, the story of the sun rising in the east and setting in the west, and what happens to the sun while it's there, and pay attention to the direction that it's moving. Says Colloquy. Definitely think we need some kind of ritual or shared language. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's what I was trying to say. Appreciate the language assist. Says it seems that music helps our best form of group therapy. Yeah. +1 on that. Whenever we get a golden age in a genre of music, corporations and other groups export and dilute. Man, they swoop in and just start to copy and paste and extra hard. Does anyone in the chat know any good books on vibration? You know, if you want to get a good primer, go take a look at that book that was made by the 3 initiates called the Kabbalion. Start there. Because it sounds like you may not know too much about these things in general. Start there. Because it's a good compendium to get you started on other topics that are related to esoteric thought with regards to that. And from there, you'll know where to go. Yeah, start with the Kabbalion. They've got an excellent chapter on frequency and vibration there as well as some other thoughts that'll help you out. I work in mental health in direct care capacity. I wish there was a way I could arrive. I advance to be of service without being beholden to the intersectionalist feminist framework. Fam, we got to talk about that, because it's literally creating a trap where You're being gaslighted into these positions, and you're being offered the ultimatum of get into this intersectional status quo or get drugged to death. So people just don't say anything, and then they're not offered any tools to deal and compartmentalize these things, when really these are just symptoms of exhaustion. Lazu says, come to Uganda, bro. Man, that's in the process, man. It's in the process. Different environment really makes a big deal. Says that's on us allowing folk to control what's ours. Kind of a catch-22, because to turn it down for the culture while your family still struggles is selfless, and most of us can't afford that. I mean, that is what it means to be Black in America at this point. That is why we have to deal with this dual consciousness. The places that we probably least belong in, we're there because what other option is there? And then we stack that on top of the fact that, you know, we don't trust each other. And it just reinforces the conditioning. It's kind of this perfect Chinese finger trap. You know, you try to go deeper in, but the deeper you go into it, hard it is to get out. You got to be invested, but you know, the more you invest, you ain't going nowhere. You're stuck. I guess that's why it gets called the quote trap, end quote, but it's another convo. Yeah, shout out to the 3 initiates. I don't even think we'll ever figure out who they were, but they sure enough did make a good little compendium to kind of condense a lot of these concepts into one. And that's good to use if you don't have a discipline to start with or a tradition that's being handed to you. There are many great guitar players, but there's a reason Jimi Hendrix is still considered the best worldwide. You know what? Message. Obi says, could you do a show on the topic? Which one in particular? Let me know. And if you guys ever have a topic you want me to go over, all you have to do is take a look at my contact information. It's in my description, my channel description. Got Janfar77 Os. Labranol. Chaos Magic. Says I only know half, still learning. Just got to keep working at it, fam. Says musically speaking, I've always said that it seems like hip hop always took a violent turn as soon as it started getting more positive. Look, any movement we get a part of, once we start getting momentum in a positive direction, it starts turning heads, because generally speaking, since we occupy lower vibrational frequencies, when we increase, we bring the floor up with us. It's what I call raising the octave. Everybody notices. Secrets of the Ages is a good one, but we bring up the Kabbalion just because it's a shorter book. It's very concise. It breaks down into that, and it's good to augment Manly P. Hall's work along with, you know, having a baseline from there. Maybe we should have a conversation on the esoteric conversation, because that's one thing that, again, I'm noticing a gap in, and I think there's a direct relationship between the two. I wanted to save it for breaking down Carl Jung's Red Book, but we'll see. There seems to be an appetite for it. Esotericism is my shit. Yao Morris is my teacher, and that's no. Oh, got you. I got you, man. Says, yep, story of my life. I can't say I've learned how to balance the dilemma of investing in others while investing in myself. You know, I wrote a little something on that, and that's what I'll conclude on that. So can I get a Congo cross reference? You can Google it, but stand by on that. because I thought that was more common knowledge than what a lot of folks talk about. But yeah, I'll get you. We'll talk. If you've got IG, hit me up on IG. It's the same name, the nameless protagonist. You guys can reach me there. And I think since there's a bit of an interest, we'll talk about hoodoo. We'll talk about the Kemet Congo African American connection. I think it's worth it. And definitely, since we've got a lot of folks from the Congo that frequent the space, we're due for a convo anyway. The Sufis and the Kabbalah are a great way to start with. They can be an entry point. I got my issues with modern Kabbalah thanks to the small hats and the hijacking of a lot of that information, but all roads lead to Kemet, in my subjective opinion. But I digress. She said Google's playing games. Yeah, I'll drop you some references later so you can investigate that. But my advice is you start with the Amduat. Start there. And then go back to what we were saying about the ring dancing and the shout. And I think you'll see some similarities. There's a reason why things flow in the direction that they do. But with that, I guess we'll go ahead and wind down. I overshot. We damn near 2 hours. I didn't mean that. But yeah, you guys go over to Rogers. He's streaming now. I didn't see what the topic was, but he's going into that. And I will definitely keep the feedback in mind from today. Mental health and getting into more esoteric conversations, I think is something I'm definitely down for. I can put that forward, but I wanted to give a response to Brother Black Pill Therapy, and hopefully, it encourages him to do more conversations about the topic. The link to the videos are in the description. A link to all the resources drawn upon today are also in the description. You guys know how you can reach me at the Nameless Protagonist on Instagram and morbidgnosis@gmail.com. But with that said, to the founders of the space, os. To those of you who've joined me in the chat, os. And for those of you listening on the playback, os. This is the Nameless Protagonist. And remember, wari wari no michi. This is the way.